The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked inside Opal Langston's coat pocket like a loaded pistol she had not yet found the courage to fire. She had been riding since before first light, the pale gray sky pressing down over the Kansas plains like a wool blanket left out in the rain, heavy and colorless, and cold in that particular way that late October carried in the year 1882. Her horse, a steady buckskin mare named Rosalind, picked her way along the rutted wagon road without complaint, steam rising from her nostrils in small clouds that dissolved almost as quickly as they formed. Opal sat straight in the saddle the way her father had taught her, chin up, shoulders square, even though every mile she had covered since leaving the town of Harlow Creek had made her chest feel a little more like a stone quarry, dense and heavy and full of sharp edges. She had not asked for this errand. She had not volunteered for it either, not exactly, though she supposed the truth was more complicated than either of those simple statements allowed. The truth was that when Harlow Creek's only attorney, Mr. Silas Drummond, had announced that he could not make the 12-mile ride to the Prescott ranch himself on account of his gout, he had looked around his dusty little office at the assembled witnesses of Thomas Prescott's last will and testament, and his rheumy eyes had landed on Opal the way trouble so often did, with an air of inevitability. "You ride well enough," he had said to her, as if that settled everything. And she did ride well enough. That was the problem. Opal Langston was 24 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher, and a woman who had come west from Missouri with more backbone than most men she'd ever met. Her mother had died 3 winters ago from fever, and her father had followed just the previous spring, and so Opal had been navigating the world on her own for long enough now that she understood the particular loneliness of being capable. When you could do a thing, people expected you to do it. There was no room in other people's expectations for the consideration of whether you wanted to. She had been in Mr. Drummond's office that afternoon because she worked for him, 3 days a week, copying documents and organizing the endless accumulation of papers that a frontier attorney gathered the way addicts gathered dust. She had been there when they read the will. She had been there when the full weight of what Thomas Prescott had decided descended over the assembled room like a cold front rolling in off the open range. And now she was the one carrying that weight out to the man it would fall on. Vernon Prescott. She knew him only by reputation and by sight, having seen him twice in town over the past 2 years since she had settled in Harlow Creek. He was not an easy man to forget once you'd seen him. He was somewhere in his early 30s, tall in the way that men who spend their days on horseback tend to be tall, with dark eyes and a jaw that looked as though it had been carved out of the same red sandstone that edged the creek beds around here. He did not say much from what she had observed, but when he did speak, people listened. He had built the Prescott Ranch himself after arriving in Kansas with almost nothing 12 years ago, and anyone who had worked alongside him spoke of him with a kind of quiet reverence that Opal found more telling than any loud praise. His father, Thomas Prescott, had been a different kind of man entirely. She knew that from the whispers in Drummond's office. Thomas had been a gambler, a drinker, and in his final years, a man who had made a series of increasingly catastrophic decisions that his son had spent the better part of a decade quietly correcting. Vernon had borrowed money, worked through winters that cracked the skin off a man's hands, and had slowly, stubbornly turned the Prescott Ranch into something real and solid. He ran cattle and horses both, had a small crew of ranch hands he treated fairly, and by all accounts had made his peace with the fact that his father was more burden than blessing. And now Thomas Prescott had died, and the will that Silas Drummond had read aloud in his little office had revealed one final, devastating blow delivered from beyond the grave. Opal could see the ranch now, coming up on the left side of the road where the land dipped toward a wide, shallow creek lined with cottonwood trees that had gone bright yellow with the season. The main house was a good-sized structure of weathered timber and limestone, solid and unpretentious, with a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Behind it sat a barn that had been recently repainted, its red sides vivid against the pale grass, and several outbuildings in neat arrangement. Corrals held horses of various colors, and in the near pasture she could see cattle moving slowly in the way cattle did in cold weather, conserving heat without any particular urgency. It was a beautiful place, she thought. A person could see in the architecture of it, in the careful order of the fences and the well-maintained troughs, and the stack of cut wood that stood against the north wall of the house, precisely how much effort had gone into its creation and preservation. You could see a man's character in his property, her father had always said, and looking at the Prescott ranch, she thought she understood Vernon Prescott better than she had any right to, having never held a proper conversation with him, which made what she was about to do considerably harder. She guided Rosalind through the gate and up the packed dirt path toward the house, and before she had reached the hitching post out front, the door opened and a man stepped out onto the porch. He was wearing work clothes, a heavy canvas coat over dark trousers, and his hat was already on his head, which told her he had not just come from sleep or a fire but had been out working and had only recently come inside. He had a cup in his hand, and he looked at her with the calm, measuring expression of a man who was accustomed to assessing things quickly and accurately. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," Opal replied, bringing Rosalind to a stop and swinging down from the saddle with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it since childhood. She looped the reins over the hitching post and turned to face him. Up close he was even more striking than she remembered, with a tiredness around his eyes that spoke not of laziness, but of long seasons of hard work. There was gray at his temples, just a touch, though she estimated him at no more than 33 or 34. "Are you Vernon Prescott?" "I am," he said. He had not moved from his spot on the porch, but his posture had shifted in a subtle way, the cup held a little more carefully, his weight distributed a little more evenly on his boots, as if some instinct in him had recognized that something significant was approaching. "And you are?" "Opal Langston. I work for Silas Drummond, the attorney in Harlow Creek. I've been sent out on his behalf." She paused, because this was the moment when she had to decide how to proceed, and she had been deciding it for 12 miles and had still not found a method that felt anything other than brutal. "It concerns your father's estate." Something moved across his face. It was not grief exactly, not in the raw sense of the word. Thomas Prescott had died 10 days ago and the funeral had come and gone, and she suspected that the grief Vernon Prescott felt for his father was the kind that had been accumulating and processing for years, long before any death certificate was drawn up. What moved across his face was something more like bracing, the deliberate steadying of a man preparing to receive weight. "Come inside," he said. "It's cold out here." She followed him through the front door into a main room that was warm from a cast-iron stove in the corner, the walls lined with the practical furnishings of a working ranch. A heavy table, solid chairs, a sideboard with a few personal items arranged on it, and on one wall a bookshelf with a modest but genuine collection of volumes that surprised her pleasantly. He gestured toward the table, and she took a seat, setting the leather satchel she had carried across her lap during the ride onto the table in front of her. He hung his coat on a hook by the door and brought another cup of coffee from the pot on the stove, setting it in front of her without asking whether she wanted it. She wrapped her hands around it gratefully. The warmth was real and immediate. Vernon Prescott sat down across from her and looked at her with those dark, level eyes, and he said, "Tell me." She had practiced different versions of this moment a dozen times on the ride out. She had thought about leading gently, about providing context, about building toward the news the way a good attorney might, with careful architecture. But sitting across from him now, looking at the patient steadiness of his expression, she found that all of her rehearsed approaches dissolved, and what was left was simply the truth. "Your father amended his will 6 months before his death," she said. "The amendment was signed and witnessed legally, and Mr. Drummond has confirmed its validity." She reached into the satchel and withdrew the document, sliding it across the table toward him. The original will left the ranch in its entirety to you. The amendment introduces a second beneficiary, a man named Dalton Greer. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. She watched Vernon Prescott's face. He did not flinch. He picked up the document and read it with the careful attention of a man reading something he needed to understand fully before he responded to it. She watched his eyes move across the lines of Mr. Drummond's careful legal handwriting, and she watched his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, and she watched him arrive at the specific passages that mattered and slow his reading there, going over them twice. When he set the paper down, his expression was composed. Not vacant, not numb, but genuinely composed, in the way a man is composed when he has spent years preparing himself for the worst that his father was capable of. 40%, he said. Yes, she said. The amendment grants Dalton Greer a 40% ownership interest in the Prescott Ranch and all improvements thereon. And Dalton Greer is the man your father owed money to, she said, because Mr. Drummond had explained the background and she saw no kindness in dancing around it. Your father borrowed a significant sum from him approximately 8 months ago. Mr. Drummond believes the amendment was offered and accepted in lieu of cash repayment. Vernon Prescott looked at the document again, then looked at her. The silence stretched for a few seconds, and in that silence she heard the wind pressing against the side of the house and the low sound of cattle somewhere distant and the faint pop and settle of the stove in the corner. How much did he borrow? Vernon asked. $700. Another silence. She could see him doing the mathematics of it, the brutal arithmetic of what his father had traded for $700, 40% of a ranch that she estimated, from the documents she had handled in Drummond's office, to be worth something close to $8,000 in total. He began. Yes, she said softly. He nodded slowly. He reached out and turned the document to face him again, reading it a third time. Then he set it down flat on the table and rested his hands beside it, both palms down, and looked at the wood grain of the table for a moment before looking back up at her. Who is Dalton Greer? She asked because the name had clearly meant something to him and she found she genuinely wanted to understand. A land speculator out of Dodge City, Vernon said. He came through here about a year ago buying up properties. He's been methodical about it. Small ranches first, pieces of larger ones when he can manage it. He paused. He approached me directly 2 years ago and I turned him down. He apparently found a more receptive audience. Your father. My father. He said it without particular bitterness, or rather with the kind of bitterness that has been carried so long it no longer sharpens. It had become simply a weight, familiar and constant. Opal felt the discomfort of her position acutely. She was the messenger of something catastrophic delivered to a man who had clearly spent years protecting himself and his land from exactly this kind of intrusion. And she had arrived at his door on a Tuesday morning and laid it all out in front of him, and now she was sitting here watching him absorb it, and she felt a powerful and irrational urge to take it all back, to fold the document into her pocket and ride away and pretend none of this had happened. I'm sorry, she said. He looked at her then with an expression that caught her off guard in its directness. It was not the polite dismissal of someone who is too proud to accept sympathy. It was something more measured than that, an acknowledgement that her sympathy was real and that he was receiving it as such. Thank you, he said, for coming all the way out here yourself instead of just sending a letter. Mr. Drummond felt it deserved to be delivered in person. Mr. Drummond has gout, Vernon said, and there was just the faintest suggestion of dry humor in it, barely a flicker, but enough that she felt the tension in her own chest ease a fraction. His gout is extensive, she agreed. He almost smiled. She watched it come to the edge of his expression and then recede, crowded out by the heavier considerations pressing on him. But it had been real, that almost smile, and she found herself noting it the way you note something unexpectedly beautiful, a hawk riding a thermal, a particular shade of light on dry grass. How long do I have before Greer can act on this? Vernon asked, returning to practicalities with the efficient pivot of a man who could not afford to be lost in feeling for long. "The estate must be formally probated," she said. "Mr. Drummond estimates that process will take between 2 and 4 months. Until probate is closed and the transfer is recorded, nothing can change officially, but Mr. Greer has been notified of the amendment's existence." "Of course he has. He will likely make contact with you soon." "He already has," Vernon said. "He sent a man out here 4 days ago. I sent him away. I didn't know what he was referencing at the time. I do now." He looked at the document one more time, then pushed it back toward her. "Keep that in Drummond's possession." "I don't want it in this house." She slid it carefully back into the satchel. She became aware, suddenly, that she had finished her coffee without noticing, and that the ride back to Harlow Creek was 12 miles of cold wind, and that her body was considerably more tired than she had admitted to herself on the journey out. She had not eaten since the previous evening, having left before breakfast that morning. She began gathering herself to stand, and that was when he said it. He said it simply, without ceremony, looking at the table and then looking at her, and his voice had in it a quality she had not expected from a man who had presented himself with such composed self-sufficiency. A quality that was not quite vulnerability but was adjacent to it, was the honest acknowledgement of a human need. "Would you stay a while?" he said. "I'd rather not sit with this alone right now." She stopped. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with those dark, steady eyes, and there was nothing in his expression that was pleading or self-pitying or manipulative. It was simply an honest request from a man who had just received a considerable blow and who recognized, with the clear-eyed practicality that seemed to characterize everything about him, that sitting alone with bad news was worse than sitting with it in company. She thought about the 12 miles back. She thought about Mr. Drummond's office and the copying work that waited for her there. She thought about her own small rented room above the milliner's shop on the main street of Harlow Creek, where she would return and eat something and sit by her own small window and look out at the street and be, as she always was, perfectly alone with her own life. "All right," she said, and settled back in her chair. He went to the stove and refilled both cups without a word, and then he sat down across from her again, and for a few minutes they simply sat in the warmth of the kitchen while the wind pushed at the house and the fire ticked in the stove, and there was something in that shared silence that was, against all reason, the most comfortable she had felt in a long time. Then he said, "Tell me something about yourself, Opal Langston, not about the law or the will. Just something." She was surprised by the request. She thought about deflecting it, and then she thought about why she would do that, and she couldn't identify a good reason. "I came here from Missouri," she said, "about 2 years ago. My parents both passed within a year of each other, and I had no remaining family there to stay for. I'd heard that Kansas was the kind of place where a person could build something from nothing." "And have you?" he asked. There was genuine curiosity in it. "I'm working on it," she said honestly, slowly. "I've seen you in town," he said. "Twice, I think. You were coming out of Drummond's office the first time, and the second time you were at the hardware store. I remember seeing you," she said, and then felt a warmth in her face that she hoped the low light in the room was kind enough to conceal. "I should have introduced myself," he said. "I tend not to in town. I'm better out here." He looked around the kitchen at the walls and the stove and the window with its view of the cottonwood trees along the creek going bright yellow in the October light. "This is where I know how to be. It's a very good place," she said. "I noticed the bookshelf." Something warmed in his expression quietly. "You read." "My father was a schoolteacher," she said. "Reading was not optional." "What did you last read?" "Great Expectations," she said. "I borrowed it from the lending library the church ladies run. Before that, a book on natural history that I liked rather more than I expected to." "I have a natural history book on that shelf," he said, nodding toward the other room. "Also a Dickens. Also a volume on cattle breeding that is considerably less engaging but more immediately practical." She laughed. It came out of her before she decided to allow it, a small, real laugh, and she watched his face when she did, and saw that it affected him in some way he was not entirely prepared for, a brief unguardedness moving across his features before the composure settled back. They talked. That was the simple, remarkable fact of the next 2 hours. They talked the way people talk when they are unexpectedly well matched for conversation, following threads from one subject to another without the laborious stretching that marked interactions with people you had less in common with. He told her about building the ranch, about the first winter when 3 of his cattle died in a blizzard, and he had stood in the frozen field afterward and made a decision to stay anyway. She told him about her first weeks in Harlow Creek, living off the money from selling her parents' furniture and trying to find work before that money ran out, the particular terror of being utterly alone and utterly responsible for your own continued survival. Outside, the morning became afternoon. One of his ranch hands knocked on the door at midday, a young man named Eli who was perhaps 20, with a freckled face and a hat that was too large for him, and Vernon told him briefly what had happened with the will and what to expect from Dalton Greer. Eli's face went through a rapid sequence of emotions that ended in a resolute anger on Vernon's behalf, and he said several things about Greer that were not strictly polite, and Vernon listened and said, "I know, but we'll handle it." When Eli had gone, Opal stood and said she really did need to be getting back. Vernon stood as well, and she noticed that he was slow to move toward the door, that there was a subtle reluctance in the way he reached for his coat. "I'm going to fight this," he said. It was not a proclamation so much as a statement of simple fact, the way a man might observe that it would rain before nightfall. "Mr. Drummond believes there may be grounds to challenge the amendment," she said. "Your father was not in the best health in his final months. There could be an argument regarding his mental state when the document was signed. Would you—" He stopped. He looked at her with that directness again. "Would you be willing to work on this with me? Through Drummond's office, I mean. I know it's not your usual work, but you know the documents and you've already explained it more clearly to me than Drummond has managed to in 3 written letters. And I—" He paused again, and she saw him weigh his words with the care of someone who was not accustomed to asking for things. "I would find it easier, I think, to be working on this with someone I can talk to." She stood in his doorway with the cold air coming in from outside and the warm air from his house at her back, and she looked at him and felt something shift in the architecture of her own quiet life, felt a door she had not noticed standing closed begin to ease open. "I'll speak with Mr. Drummond," she said. The next 3 weeks moved with a momentum that Opal had not anticipated. She spoke with Drummond the following morning, and to his credit, the old attorney recognized quickly that having Opal coordinate directly with Vernon Prescott would allow him to manage the case from his gout-afflicted chair without sacrificing any efficiency. He agreed, with only modest grumbling, that she could serve as the working liaison for the probate challenge. This meant that Vernon came to Harlow Creek twice in the following week, and both times he came to Drummond's office, and she was the one who sat across the desk from him and laid out the strategy. The grounds for challenge were real, she had decided, having gone carefully through every document in the file. Thomas Prescott had been treated by a physician in Dodge City for what his letters described as confusion and declining faculties during the same period when the amendment had been signed. There was a question of whether he had truly understood what he was signing. On the second visit, when they had finished the formal business, Vernon asked if she would walk with him to get something to eat, and she said yes without any of the deliberation she might have applied to such an invitation a month ago. They went to the small restaurant that Mrs. Hendricks ran in the back of her dry goods store, 2 tables with checkered cloths and a menu of 3 things, and they ate beef stew and cornbread and talked for an hour and a half about things that had nothing to do with the legal case. She noticed things about him in those conversations. She noticed that he listened with his full attention, which was rarer than it should have been. She noticed that he had a precise and detailed knowledge of the land around Harlow Creek, its geology, its seasonal rhythms, the way the creek ran high in spring and low in August, that spoke of years of careful observation. She noticed that he was funny in a dry and understated way, as though humor was something he kept for small company and did not waste on large rooms. She noticed that when he laughed, which was not often but was not rare either, it transformed his face into something younger and less burdened. She realized with a mixture of pleasure and unease, becoming very much interested in Vernon Prescott. On the third week, she rode out to the ranch herself, because there were documents that needed his signature, and she told herself, quite firmly, that this was the only reason. It was a Thursday, and the sky was the hard, bright blue that sometimes came in early November, cloudless and cold, and so vivid it almost hurt to look at. She arrived at the ranch in the late morning and found him mending fence along the east pasture, a task he was performing himself rather than delegating to his hands, working with the methodical efficiency of a man who preferred to be moving. He saw her from a distance and raised a hand in greeting, and there was something in that small gesture, the simple, unstudied acknowledgement of her arrival, that landed in her chest in a way she found difficult to categorize. She tied Rosalind to the fence post and walked along the fence line to where he was working, and they conducted the signing of the documents right there in the pasture, using the flat top of a fence post as a desk and her leather satchel open as a windbreak. It was entirely impractical and oddly perfect, and when they were done, she did not immediately turn back toward her horse. "Show me around," she said, "if you have the time." He had the time. He showed her the upper pasture where the best of his horses ran, a small herd of 12 that he was breeding carefully and with evident pride, explaining the lineage of each animal with the enthusiasm of someone describing dear friends. He showed her the south field where he planned to expand his cattle operation in the coming year, walking her through his intentions for the land with such clarity that she could see exactly what it would become. He showed her the creek itself, the cottonwood grove that stood along its bank, and told her that he had planted 6 of the trees himself when they were saplings 15 years ago, that they had grown alongside his ambitions. "You must have come here very young," she said, doing the arithmetic. "I was 20, he said. "I came with my father and $30 and a horse that was not well suited to Kansas weather." A pause. "My father was not well suited to Kansas weather either, as it turned out, but the horse eventually adapted." "You stayed anyway," she said. "I couldn't see the point of leaving," he said, and he was looking at the creek as he said it, at the water running clear and cold between the pale roots of the cottonwoods. "There's something in a place you've built yourself. Once it's real, it's part of you. You can't leave without leaving part of yourself behind." She understood that. She thought about her parents' house in Missouri, about how difficult it had been to sell it, about the physical sensation of severance when the deed transferred. She thought about how she had come to Kansas partly to escape that feeling and partly to find a new place that would, in time, become hers in the same way. "I think that's why this matters so much," she said. "The ranch, it's not just property." "No," he said quietly, "it's not." They stood for a moment beside the creek, and the air smelled of cold water and dead leaves and the particular clean emptiness of the plains in November, and she was very aware of him standing beside her, of the warmth of his proximity, of the way he was looking at her with those dark, thoughtful eyes. "Opal," he said. The way he said her name was different from the way anyone else said it. She had noticed this before and had not permitted herself to examine it too closely. Now she let herself notice it fully. "Yes," she said. "I want to say something, and I want to say it straight because I don't know how to say it any other way." He turned to face her, and she turned to face him, and the creek ran past them both with its cold, indifferent conversation. "I have appreciated every minute I've spent with you since that morning. You rode up to my door with the worst news I've received in years. I know that's a strange thing to say to a person, that you appreciate them for arriving with bad news, but what I mean is that the news has faded in significance compared to the person who brought it." He stopped. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, genuinely uncertain of himself, and she found that uncertainty more affecting than all his composure combined. "I don't have a great deal of experience making myself plain in this way." "You're doing very well," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "I'd like to court you," he said. "Properly, I mean, if you're willing." She looked at him in the cold November light beside his beloved creek, and she thought about the letter in her coat pocket 12 miles ago that had felt like a loaded pistol, and how the thing it had struck had not been the man standing before her, but rather something that had needed striking the wall between two people who might otherwise have ridden past each other's lives without stopping. "I'm willing," she said. The situation with Dalton Greer worsened before it improved. He appeared in Harlow Creek in the 3rd week of November, riding in with 2 associates who had the look of men who were paid to look unpleasant, and he visited Silas Drummond's office with what Drummond later described to Opal as a great deal of charm that would not have fooled a moderately intelligent child. Greer was perhaps 45, with the well-fed confidence of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted through financial leverage rather than physical confrontation. He was not a criminal in any simple sense. He was worse than that. He was a man who operated perfectly within the law while doing things that most people, if asked, would agree were wrong. He wanted the ranch. 40% was a foothold, and a foothold was all a man like Greer needed to apply sufficient pressure until the whole structure tilted his way. Vernon knew this. Drummond knew this. Opal knew this from having spent enough time in a lawyer's office to understand how these situations tended to develop. She told Vernon about the visit when he came to town 2 days later. They were sitting in Mrs. Hendrick's small restaurant again, the afternoon light going golden and thin through the window, and she watched his face as she described the encounter. "He'll make an offer," Vernon said. "He'll offer to buy out the remaining 60% at a figure low enough to insult me, but high enough that he can claim he was being reasonable. And when you refuse, he'll make the 40% claim as difficult as possible, demand access to the books, demand involvement in decisions, file objections to every improvement I try to make, until running the place becomes more trouble than the profit justifies." He said it with the tiredness of a man who had already mapped every path of this particular maze. "It's a patience game. He has money and lawyers and time. He bets that I don't." "He hasn't counted on the legal challenge," she said. "How strong is it?" She had been working on this with Drummond all week, reviewing every available piece of evidence regarding Thomas Prescott's mental state in the months before his death. "Strong enough to be worth pursuing," she said carefully. "The doctor in Dodge City, a man named Calloway, wrote in his notes that Thomas was, and I'm quoting, suffering from considerable confusion regarding matters of business and personal affairs. That's significant. If we can get Dr. Calloway to provide a statement, and if we can establish that Greer knew about Thomas's condition when he presented the amendment for signing, we have a real argument." "Greer would have known," Vernon said. "A man like Greer does his research." "That's exactly what we'll argue." She hesitated. "There's one more thing. There was a man present when the amendment was signed, a witness other than Drummond's colleague who notarized it, a man named Earl Dobbins who works at the livery stable in Dodge City. He signed as the secondary witness." "What about him?" "I think he saw Thomas Prescott that day," she said. "I think he would remember the state the man was in. Whether his memory will be useful depends on what he actually saw, but if Thomas was visibly confused or unwell, a straightforward witness account could be exactly what we need." She paused again. "Someone would need to go to Dodge City to speak with him." Vernon looked at her. "Would you come with me?" She had not been to Dodge City. It was 50 miles southwest, a longer journey than she had undertaken alone since arriving in Kansas, and it would require at least 2 nights away from Harlow Creek. She thought about propriety, and then thought about what was at stake, and then thought, more honestly, about the fact that the thought of making the journey with Vernon did not produce any anxiety, but rather something that was almost entirely anticipation. "I'll speak with Mr. Drummond," she said. Drummond gave his blessing to the Dodge City trip with the relieved expression of a man being spared travel, and on the second Saturday of November, Opal and Vernon set out southwest on the main road in a buckboard wagon that Vernon had borrowed from his neighbor, a practical choice over horseback given the distance and the documents they were carrying. He drove and she sat beside him with her satchel on her lap, and within the first hour the distance fell away behind them and ahead of them. The plains opened up in their winter colors, brown and gold, and the pale silver of dry grass where the light caught it. They talked the whole way. 2 days of travel with someone is a particular kind of intimacy, she discovered, distinct from the contained conversations of a lawyer's office or a restaurant. Out here there was no structure to fall back on, no table to serve as the formal boundary of the interaction, no social convention that prescribed the topics or the duration. There was only the road and the grass and the sky and the two of them, and what filled the space between them was whatever was real. She learned that he had read more than she had expected, that he had strong opinions about the management of water resources on the plains, and believed that the lack of attention to watershed preservation would cause serious problems within the next 20 years. That he had been engaged briefly to a woman from Wichita 6 years ago, and that it had ended when she had made clear that she found ranch life incompatible with the life she actually wanted, and that he had understood her clearly enough not to be bitter about it, only a little lonely afterward for longer than he expected. That he was genuinely funny when he allowed himself to be, the dry humor surfacing more freely with each hour of easy company until it was a regular and delightful feature of the conversation. She told him things she had not told many people. About the year she had spent nursing her mother through the fever and how exhausting and grief-saturated it had been, and how she had then turned around and done it again the following year for her father, and how by the time she had come to Kansas she had been tired in a way that she had not fully recognized until it slowly, gradually, over the following 2 years, began to lift. About how she had chosen law work not because she had planned to, but because it turned out that she was good at the precise application of language to complicated situations, and that this had come as a genuine surprise, and how surprising yourself in that particular way was one of the better feelings available. They stopped for the night at a small settlement called Pawnee Crossing, where there was a modest inn of 6 rooms run by a Mennonite family who cooked an extraordinary supper of roast chicken and preserved vegetables and fresh bread, and who asked no intrusive questions about the nature of the two travelers' relationship, a discretion Opal appreciated considerably. After supper they sat for a while in the common room, reading by the fire. She had brought a book and he had brought one too, and they read in comfortable parallel silence for an hour before she said good night and went upstairs. She lay in the narrow bed in her small room and listened to the wind outside and felt, with a clarity that both pleased and slightly terrified her, that she was falling in love with Vernon Prescott. It was not the giddy, disorienting version of the feeling she associated with the romantic novels she had read as a younger woman, the kind that overrode sensible thinking and produced decisions that looked, in retrospect, more like fever than feeling. It was steadier than that. It was the feeling of finding solid ground, of recognizing something she had not known she was looking for but could now see with perfect clarity. It was the feeling of someone specific, this particular person, in this particular place, being exactly the right fit for the particular shape of her own life. She was not sure what he felt. She knew he had said he wanted to court her, and she knew what she had seen in his face in the moments when his composure receded, and she thought she knew. But she was also a careful person who had learned to verify before concluding. She fell asleep with the wind in the grass outside and the fire from downstairs warming the floorboards beneath her, and she slept better than she had in months. Dodge City in November was a different animal from the wild summer version of itself that the newspapers wrote about. The famous cattle season was over, the drovers gone, and what remained was a working town with a more genuine and less theatrical character, a place of commerce and winter preparation, of hardware stores and feed suppliers, and the steady hum of people managing practical lives. They found a boarding house for a second night's stay and went directly to find Dr. Calloway. The doctor was a compact, careful man with spectacles and the unhurried manner of someone who had seen enough human drama that very little could accelerate his pace. He listened to their inquiry with full attention and then sat for a long moment. "Thomas Prescott," he said. "Yes. He came to me 3 times in the spring and summer. His memory was significantly impaired. He confused dates, confused the names of people he had known for years, sometimes could not hold the thread of a conversation for more than a few minutes." He paused. "I told him at his second visit that he should not be making binding legal arrangements without the counsel of someone he trusted, who could verify his understanding of what he was agreeing to." "Did he appear to have such counsel when he came to sign the amendment?" Opal asked. Calloway looked at her. "I was not present at the signing, but I can tell you that the deterioration in his condition between my first and third visits was significant. By the third visit, I would not have considered him capable of understanding a complex contractual arrangement." "Would you be willing to provide a written statement to that effect?" she asked. "I would," he said, without hesitation. It took 3 hours to obtain the statement in the form that would be legally useful, Opal going through it line by line with Calloway and his nurse, who served as a second witness. When it was done, she held the document carefully and felt the particular satisfaction of a person who has managed to extract order from a complicated situation. And she looked across the room at Vernon and saw in his expression a gratitude that was not about the document alone. Earl Dobbins at the livery stable was a different sort of encounter. He was a weathered, taciturn man of perhaps 60 who listened to their questions about Thomas Prescott with the wary expression of someone who was not certain what the correct answer was supposed to be. But when Opal asked him directly, not leading him, simply asking him what he had seen on the day the amendment was signed, the man exhaled slowly and said that Thomas Prescott had appeared to him to be not quite right in the head, that the old man had asked him twice what year it was and had seemed confused about where he was. He was willing to provide a statement. He was not enthusiastic about it, but he was willing. They rode back to Harlow Creek on a Sunday, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened snow but did not yet deliver it, and they arrived in the dark blue of early evening with the lanterns of the town visible ahead of them like scattered embers. Before they reached the edge of town, Vernon stopped the wagon. She looked at him. He was looking at the lights of Harlow Creek, and then he turned to look at her, and his expression in the low light was more open than she had yet seen it, the composure that usually inhabited his features replaced by something less defended. "I'm grateful," he said, "for everything you've done. For going out of your way, considerably out of your way, for someone who was a stranger to you 3 weeks ago." "You're not a stranger now," she said. "No," he said, "I'm not." He looked at her for a moment longer. "I want you to know that what I said by the creek was not said lightly. I'm not a man who says things lightly." "I know that about you," she said. "Do you feel—" He stopped and she saw him make a decision to continue. "Do you feel anything of the same kind?" The lantern light from the approaching town fell soft and indirect over his face, and she could see the genuine uncertainty in his question, this man who was certain about most things being uncertain about this particular thing, and she found that she did not want to leave him in that uncertainty any longer than was necessary. "Yes," she said. "I feel it more than I have words for, which is saying something because I generally have quite a few words." He looked at her, and the corner of his mouth turned, that almost smile becoming something complete and real, and it changed his whole face in the way she had noticed before, and she thought, with a certainty that was not hasty but well constructed and solid as limestone, that she was going to be very happy with this person. The legal challenge proceeded through December with the deliberate pace of frontier jurisprudence. Drummond filed the formal contest in the first week of the month, presenting Dr. Calloway's statement and Dobbin's affidavit as primary evidence of Thomas Prescott's diminished capacity at the time of signing. Dalton Greer responded, as expected, through his attorneys in Dodge City, with a challenge to the challenge, arguing that Thomas's lucid periods had been frequent and sufficient for the amendment to be valid, and producing his own witnesses who were prepared to testify to Thomas's apparent competence. It was Opal who noticed the problem with Greer's witnesses. She was going through the respondents' filings on a gray December afternoon, sitting at her small desk in Drummond's office while the old attorney dozed in his chair by the stove, and she read the names of Greer's witnesses twice, and then sat back and thought carefully, and then went to the filing cabinet and pulled out the property records for the region. One of Greer's witnesses, a man named Culver Barrett, had sold his property to Greer's Land Company 14 months earlier. Another, a woman named Adelaide Cross, was the sister of a man who currently worked for Greer's operation in Dodge City. Neither of these connections was, on its own, necessarily disqualifying. People had complicated relationships, and a connection to one party did not automatically invalidate testimony. But they were connections that had not been disclosed, and the failure to disclose them was significant, and she thought that if she could establish that these connections existed and had been deliberately withheld, the credibility of Greer's entire case would be considerably damaged. She was still sitting with this thought, turning it over and examining it from multiple angles, when Vernon arrived with the early evening, his coat dusted with snow from the first real storm of the season that had begun in the afternoon. He had come to discuss the latest developments with Drummond, and he found Opal instead, awake and assembled around the filing cabinet with 3 months' worth of property records spread across the floor. He stood in the doorway and looked at the organized chaos of papers and then looked at her. "What have you found?" he asked. She told him. He sat down on the floor beside the papers without any ceremony, coat still on, and began reading what she handed him with his full, careful attention, and they spent the next 2 hours going through the records together while the snow fell outside and Drummond slept in his chair, and the stove kept the small office warm. "If you can prove Barrett and the Cross connection," Vernon said when they had laid it all out, "Greer has nothing." "It won't be quick," she said. "We'll need to obtain the original property transfer documents from the county recorder in Dodge City, and Barrett's testimony will need to be challenged formally, which means another set of filings, but it can be done." "Yes," she said, "it can be done." He looked at her across the spread of papers and firelight, and what was in his expression then was not just gratitude or legal relief, but something warmer and more particular, the specific regard one person has for another when they have come to know them well enough to recognize what is genuinely remarkable about them. "Opal," he said. "Yes. Would you come to the ranch for Christmas?" She had not been thinking about Christmas. She had been thinking about property records and witness credibility and the strategic timing of filings. But the question, arriving into her concentration like a warm hand on her shoulder, reoriented her instantly. "Your ranch hands will be there," he said. "Eli and the others. It wouldn't be just the two of us, but I'd like you to be there." A pause. "It would be the first Christmas in a long time that I wouldn't be looking forward to simply because it would end." She heard the loneliness in that, and she recognized it because she had her own version of it, the particular ache of holidays when the family structures that are supposed to hold them together are no longer intact, when you are the last remaining piece of something that was meant to be larger. "I'll come," she said. She came on Christmas Eve afternoon, riding Rosalind through the light snow that had fallen overnight and frozen thin, the prairie glittering in the pale winter sun. The ranch looked like something from an illustrated magazine, the warm light in the windows of the main house, smoke from the chimney rising straight up in the still air, the cottonwood trees along the creek standing silver bare and beautiful. Eli met her at the gate with visible excitement that he was trying to disguise as professionalism and not quite managing. He had been watching for her from the barn and said so, and then appeared to regret saying so, and she liked him enormously. There were 4 ranch hands total. Eli, a quiet man named Silas who was not related to Drummond, a Mexican vaquero named Rodrigo who had been with Vernon for 5 years, and who greeted Opal with a formal courtesy she found touching, and a young man named Pete who was 19 and treated the holiday with the barely suppressed enthusiasm of a child. Vernon was in the kitchen when she came inside, and the kitchen smelled of the best kind of things roasting meat, something that involved cinnamon and apples, bread and coffee, and she stood in the doorway for a moment and simply absorbed it before he turned from the stove and saw her. His face when he saw her. She would not forget it. It was the face of a man whose life had, in that moment, assumed a configuration that suited him. "You're here," he said. "I'm here," she agreed. Christmas at the Prescott Ranch was as fine a day as Opal could remember. They ate at the big table with all the hands together, the kind of gathering that was less formal and more genuine than any society dinner, full of laughter and stories and the particular warmth of people who worked hard and knew the value of a good meal in good company. After supper, Rodrigo played guitar by the fire, and even the usually silent Silas sang along to a song or two in a surprisingly good baritone. Vernon gave her a book. He had ordered it from a catalog, a recent volume on the natural history of the Great Plains, and he presented it with a brief, direct explanation. "You mentioned you liked natural history more than you expected. This one covers the Central Plains specifically. I thought you would find it relevant." She gave him a small compass that she had found in Harlow Creek's general store, silver-cased with a simple engraving, because she had thought of him when she saw it and had not resisted the impulse. He looked at it for a long moment, and then looked at her with an expression that told her she had chosen correctly. Later, when the hands had gone to their bunkhouse and the house was quiet and the fire had burned low, they sat on the covered porch despite the cold, wrapped in heavy coats, watching the stars over the snow-bright plains. The sky was immense and clear and full of stars in the way that you only ever fully appreciated away from lamplit streets, and they sat in the shared silence and the shared beauty of it, and Vernon reached over and took her hand, a simple, deliberate gesture, and she let him hold it, and they stayed like that for a long time. He did not say anything, and neither did she, because there was nothing that language could add to what was already present between them in the cold, clear dark. January and February brought the full force of the Kansas winter, the kind that settled in and made itself comfortable and showed no inclination to leave. The legal proceedings continued at their deliberate pace, with Opal filing the additional documentation on the witness connections in the second week of January, and the judge assigned to the probate case, a man named Hartley who sat in the county seat at some 40 miles northeast, taking his time in reviewing the evidence. During those months, Vernon came to town every week, sometimes twice. He came for legal consultations that sometimes lasted 20 minutes and were followed by 2 hours of other things, walking in the cold streets, eating at Mrs. Hendrick's, talking in the warmth of the restaurant long after the coffee had grown cold. He brought her a piece of cottonwood bark once, shaped exactly like a crescent moon, that he had found along the creek and thought she would like, and she kept it on her windowsill. She brought him small things too, a newspaper article she had saved because the subject matter made her think of him, a length of particularly fine leather cord from the saddler that would suit a repair he had mentioned needing to make. These small reciprocities were their courtship, its particular language, and she found it more eloquent than flowers or formal gifts. In February, on a night when the temperature had dropped low enough that the ice on the creek was a foot thick, and the windows in her rented room above the milliner's were rimed with frost on the inside, she sat down with herself and conducted an honest accounting of the situation. She was in love with Vernon Prescott. That was established and beyond revision. She believed he was in love with her. She had the evidence. What she did not have was any certainty about what the future held, because the future, in practical terms, was partly dependent on the outcome of the legal case. If the challenge succeeded and the amendment was overturned, Vernon would have his ranch entirely to himself, and the threat of Dalton Greer would be removed. If it failed, the pressures that Greer would bring to bear would be significant and prolonged, and the question of what that would mean for the shape of Vernon's life, and therefore the shape of any life built alongside his, was a question she had been carefully not asking herself for several weeks. She decided, sitting in the frost-edged room with the cold pressing in on all sides, that the outcome of the legal case was not the determinant of what she felt. She had been organizing her feelings around the legal situation as a way of giving herself permission to delay acknowledging them fully, and this was, she recognized, a fairly transparent evasion. What she felt was what she felt. It was not conditional. She told him as much in early March, when the first tentative warmth was beginning to suggest that the winter was considering its exit. They had been walking along the edge of the creek east of town, where the ice was beginning to break up in slow, deliberate sheets, and she had been talking about the upcoming phases of the legal case, and something in her own voice had struck her as uncharacteristically distanced, and she stopped mid-sentence. "I want to say something that isn't about the case," she said. He looked at her. "I know we've been careful," she said, "and I know there are good reasons for that. But I've been letting the legal situation stand in for things I should be saying directly, and I think that's a form of cowardice I'm not comfortable with." "Opal, I love you," she said. "I know that's perhaps too fast for certain people's standards, but I have spent 5 months in your company and I've watched you closely and I know my own mind, and what I know is that I love you." She paused. "I thought you should know that independently of everything else." He was very still for a moment. The ice cracked out on the creek, and a red-winged blackbird made its spring sound from somewhere in the dry reeds, and then he stepped forward and took her face in his hands, both his hands against her cold cheeks, and he looked at her with those dark eyes and said, "I have been in love with you since the day you rode up to my door with the worst news of my year, and stayed to make sure I wasn't alone with it." She felt the warmth of his hands against her cold face, and the warmth of those words filling up the places inside her that had been cold for considerably longer than this winter. "You are the most capable and most honest person I have ever known," he said, "and I intend to ask you to marry me when this legal business is settled, because I want to give you a situation in which you can say yes or no without the complications of an unresolved crisis bearing on your answer. But I want you to know right now, on this particular afternoon in March, that it is coming." "I appreciate the advance notice," she said, and her voice was not perfectly steady, which she was fine with. He kissed her then, there beside the breaking ice and the first red-winged blackbird of the season, and it was exactly what a first kiss between two people who have built toward each other carefully, and honestly should feel like: substantial, unhurried, certain, as solid as the limestone that ran beneath the Kansas plains. The decision in the probate case came in the second week of April. Judge Hartley ruled that the evidence of Thomas Prescott's diminished capacity at the time of the amendment's signing, combined with the undisclosed conflicts of interest in Greer's witness testimony, was sufficient to render the amendment invalid. The will reverted to its original form. The Prescott Ranch in its entirety belonged to Vernon Prescott. Opal received the written ruling at Drummond's office on a Thursday morning and read it twice before she allowed herself to feel it fully, and then she read it a third time, out loud, to Drummond, who was predictably delighted with the outcome and less predictably moved to tears, which he attributed quickly and not convincingly to his gout. She rode out to the ranch that afternoon without sending word ahead. She arrived to find Vernon and Rodrigo working in the near corral with a young horse that was still uncertain of its training, and Vernon saw her coming from the road and read something in her pace or her posture, and handed his lead rope to Rodrigo and came to meet her at the gate. She held the document out to him. He read it standing there at the gate, the April wind moving his hair, a smear of corral dust on his jaw, and she watched the ruling land in him, watched him read it once and then again, and she watched him breathe. "It's over," he said. "It's over," she confirmed. He looked up at her, and his face in the afternoon light was the most she had seen it. All the composure present, but no longer serving as armor, opened up into something that was simply relief and gratitude and the specific joy of having fought for something real and won it. He took her hand, the ruling still in his other hand, and he said, "Thank you for all of it. Every mile, every document, every word." "I would do it again," she said. "You won't have to," he said. He looked down at the ruling, then back at her. "Opal Langston." "Yes," she said. "Will you?" "Yes," she said again before he could finish it. He laughed. It was a full, unguarded laugh, the kind she had been collecting the rare instances of since the day she first heard it, and it was the best sound she had yet heard in Kansas. "I hadn't asked yet," he said. "You told me it was coming in March," she said. "I've had sufficient time to consider." He laughed again, and then he asked properly, with the ruling for his ranch in one hand and her hand in his other, there at the gate of the place he had built from nothing. And she said yes with her whole self, with no reservations and no conditions and no unresolved matters standing between her and the word. Rodrigo, watching from the corral, let out a celebratory whoop that startled the young horse into a brief frantic circle, which Rodrigo managed calmly without looking away from them, and then called out something in Spanish that was clearly approving. Eli appeared from the barn doorway and made a noise that may have been a cheer, and then looked immediately embarrassed by it and retreated back into the barn, from which sounds of muffled celebration were none the less audible. They were married in June. The ceremony was held in the small Methodist church in Harlow Creek, on a Saturday morning when the air smelled of new grass, and the prairie wildflowers had come into their brief, extravagant season. The plains outside town blooming in the colors of a painting you couldn't quite believe was real. Opal wore a dress of pale blue that she had spent 3 weeks constructing in the evenings in her rented room above the milliner's. With a small bouquet of the wildflowers she had gathered herself that morning in the early light. Vernon wore his best suit, which he had clearly pressed with considerable care, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him with the expression of a man who could not quite believe his own good fortune, and had decided to accept it anyway. Silas Drummond attended in his best coat with his gout-afflicted foot, propped on a small cushion that his housekeeper had insisted he bring. He wept openly throughout the ceremony and made no attempt to attribute it to his gout. Rodrigo, Eli, Silas the ranch hand, and Pete all sat in the front pews on Vernon's side. Eli with his too large hat held against his chest with both hands. Rodrigo in a beautifully embroidered vest that Opal had not previously seen and was very impressed by. Mrs. Hendricks from the restaurant attended and sat in the second row with a handkerchief and a proprietary air, as though the happy outcome were partly her doing, which, Opal supposed, was not entirely wrong given the many hours the two of them had spent at those checkered cloth tables. The minister, a kindly man named Reverend Cole who had known Vernon for several years, conducted the ceremony with warmth and a practical brevity that suited them both. When he reached the part about the promises, Vernon spoke his with the same direct clarity that he brought to everything, looking at her without wavering, and she felt each word land with the weight of something that had been fully considered before being spoken, not recited from convention, but meant from a real and specific place inside him. She made her own promises with the same intent, speaking them to him and to the small congregation and to herself, and when it was done and the ring was on her finger, a plain gold band that he had ridden to Dodge City to select, arriving back with it tucked in his breast pocket like something irreplaceable, which it was, she thought that she had never done anything more right in her life than this. Afterward there was a supper at Mrs. Hendricks, who had closed the restaurant to regular customers for the afternoon, and produced a spread that was extraordinary by the standards of any frontier town and would have been notable in far larger cities. There was dancing after, out in the street, because somebody had a fiddle and somebody else had a drum, and it was June, and the day was long and everyone felt like celebrating. She danced with Vernon in the dusty street of Harlow Creek as the evening light went amber and then rose, and then the particular soft blue of a summer Kansas dusk. And she thought about the October morning when she had ridden out to a stranger's ranch with a piece of paper that held his loss inside it, and how that stranger had taken the loss without flinching and had asked her not to leave him with it alone, and how that request, so simple and honest, had been the beginning of everything that had followed. She moved into the ranch that summer, bringing her small accumulation of belongings, the books, the natural history volumes, the piece of cottonwood bark shaped like a crescent moon, the practical clothing, the leather satchel, and arranging them into the spaces of the house that Vernon had, she discovered, already quietly made room for. Not intrusively, not presumptively, but thoughtfully, a wider section of shelving added to the bookshelf, a second hook by the door, the spare bedroom cleared out for use as the kind of small study he had apparently imagined she would want, which she did. She continued working part-time with Drummond through the summer and into the fall, though the nature of the work shifted. Drummond, emboldened by the success of the Prescott Challenge, had begun taking on more contested estate work, and Opal found that she had a genuine aptitude for this kind of law, the intersection of document analysis and human complexity, the work of making justice out of the chaos of what people leave behind when they die. She was not an attorney, could not be one under the law as it stood, but she was a legal clerk of unusual capability, and Drummond was not the only one who knew it. On an afternoon in September, 4 months after the wedding, she found a letter from a judge in the county seat requesting that she prepare a summary document on a contested probate matter that Drummond had nothing to do with. The judge had simply, somehow, heard of her work. She sat with the letter for a long time and felt something she had not fully expected, the particular satisfaction of being recognized for work you were actually good at, finding you and traveling the distance to reach you. She rode out to the upper pasture to tell Vernon, who was checking fences in the last of the autumn warmth. He listened, read the letter, and handed it back to her. "What does Drummond say?" he asked. "He said I should handle it myself under his supervision," she said. "He said, and this is a direct quote, 'I have gout and you have talent, and between the two of us only one of those things is useful in this situation.'" Vernon smiled, the full one that she had been accumulating since October of last year, each instance of it as good as the first. "Good," he said. "It would mean some travel," she said, "to the county seat and back." "I know," he said. "Good." He looked at her with those steady, honest eyes. "You brought yourself all the way out here to build something, Opal. I want you to build it." She reached over and fixed the collar of his coat, which had turned up against the wind, a small and domestic gesture that surprised her with its weight, with how much tenderness could be carried in a thing so simple. "We're building it," she said. By the following spring, the ranch had expanded. Vernon had added 20 head to his cattle operation, had broken and trained 4 new horses from the recent foals, and had begun the construction of a second barn that would double the wintering capacity. He had hired a 5th hand, an older man named Franklin who had 30 years of range experience and had come recommended by a ranch to the west, and with Franklin's help, the operation was running at a quality and efficiency that was beginning to attract notice from buyers as far as Wichita. And Opal was expecting their first child. She told him on a February evening by the fire, having spent several weeks in careful consideration of how to say it and ultimately deciding, as she generally did, to simply say it clearly. He went very still in the way she had come to associate with him, receiving something significant, the careful, absorbing stillness of a man whose responses were genuine, because he took the time to know what they actually were before he expressed them. Then he stood and crossed to where she sat and knelt beside her chair and took her hands in both of his, and looked at her with an expression that was the most completely open thing she had ever seen on a human face. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said, which she thought told you everything you needed to know about him. "I'm perfectly well," she said. "Everything is as it should be." He exhaled slowly and looked at their joined hands and then looked up at her. "A child," he said. "A child," she confirmed. "In this house," he said, looking around at the walls and the fire and the bookshelf and the stove and the piece of cottonwood bark shaped like a crescent moon that still sat in the window. "In this house," she said. He smiled then, slowly and completely, and reached up and touched her face with one careful hand, and she leaned into it. And outside the February wind went over the plains, and the cottonwood trees along the creek stood patient and silver in the dark. And the ranch that had been built from $30 and a horse not suited to Kansas weather contained everything that two people who had found each other through the honest accident of a bad newsletter could possibly have wanted. Their son was born in September of 1884, a loud and healthy boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn set to the jaw, whom they named Thomas Edward Prescott Thomas for the complicated, flawed, unforgettable man whose final bad decision had begun everything, Edward for Opal's father. It felt right to give the name back to something good, to let it mean something different now. Eli, when presented with the baby in the first week of the boy's life, held him with the terrified reverence of a young man encountering something extraordinary and fragile, which was accurate. Rodrigo brought a carved wooden horse, made himself over several weeks, painted in bright colors and presented with a formal dignity that made the gift more beautiful. Franklin, who had not said much about the pregnancy, brought a length of rope braided in a pattern he said his mother had taught him, which had no particular use but was very beautiful and which Opal hung on the wall beside the bookshelf. Drummond, informed by letter, wrote back one of the warmest letters she had ever received, 2 full pages in his cramped and gout-affected hand, and she read it twice and kept it. In the autumn of that year, Opal returned to part-time work with Drummond when the baby was 3 months old, leaving him in the mornings with Vernon, who had taken to fatherhood with the same focused competence he brought to the rest of his life. She would sometimes come home in the early afternoon to find the baby asleep in the crook of Vernon's arm while Vernon read, one-handed, from whatever volume he had been able to reach without disturbing either child or dog. A sheepdog named Miller who had appeared on the property the previous winter and been formally adopted, and the picture of it would stop her in the doorway with a feeling for which she had still not found adequate language, though she had tried. She took on the county seat work, and it went well, and by the end of 1884 she had developed a professional reputation as a legal clerk of uncommon skill in probate and property matters, the kind of reputation that functioned as its own advertisement and required no effort to maintain beyond the continued doing of the work to the standard she had always set for herself. Attorneys in 3 counties knew her name and sent inquiries through Drummond, who handled the professional correspondence with a territorial pride that amused her considerably. The land itself continued to reward the people who cared for it. The second barn was completed by winter and made an immediate practical difference in the operation of the ranch, the horses and cattle wintering better and entering the following spring in better condition. The cattle herd grew by careful selection, Vernon's eye for livestock being something that buyers had noticed and were willing to pay premium prices for. The horse breeding program produced 2 animals in the spring of 1885 that were so clearly exceptional in quality that a buyer from Wichita made a specific journey to the ranch to acquire them, which was the kind of thing that got talked about in the right circles. And in the quiet private economy of their life together, the things that mattered most to Opal were not the professional recognitions or the expanding herd or the reputation for good horses, as gratifying as all of those were. They were the smaller things, the conversations that continued to be easy and genuine and regularly surprising, the way he still listened with his whole attention when she spoke, the dry humor that she had learned to anticipate and always found freshly funny regardless. The books they traded back and forth, each one coming back with the other person's penciled comments in the margins, a secondary conversation conducted in small handwriting that she thought of as one of their most intimate habits. The way he still looked at her when she rode up to the gate, arriving home from Harlow Creek in the afternoon light, in whatever season it happened to be. The expression had not changed since the early days. It was the face of a man who had not taken what was good in his life for granted, and did not intend to. She had a daughter in the summer of 1886, born in the early morning of a July day when the heat had broken overnight and left the plains clear and cool, the sky the color of new milk at first light. They named her Clara Frances Prescott. Clara because they both liked the sound of it, Frances for Vernon's grandmother, whom he had spoken of with great warmth in the years of their marriage as the one figure from his early life who had offered him uncomplicated love. Thomas, who was not quite two, regarded his sister with the frank appraisal of a small person encountering something surprising and then reaching a decision. His decision, clearly, was in favor. By the time Clara was 3 months old, Thomas had appointed himself her primary guardian, and could be reliably found sitting close to wherever she was placed, attentive and proprietary in the way that big brothers apparently came pre-installed. Eli, who was by now 24 and had grown into a capable ranch hand who had lost the oversized hat in favor of one that fit him, announced in the fall of that year that he was intending to court a woman from the neighboring settlement, a schoolteacher named Anna, and he came to both Vernon and Opal to discuss it with a seriousness that was touching and slightly funny. They gave their full endorsement, and Vernon shook his hand, and Opal told him he had excellent taste in women who worked with words. They were happy. This is not a complicated or elaborate thing to say, but it is the most accurate thing, and accuracy was something that both of them valued. They were happy in the way that people are happy when they have built their lives deliberately and well, when they have been honest with themselves and with each other, when the foundation is solid enough to hold everything that has been built on it. It was not the absence of difficulty. Ranching in Kansas in the 1880s was a life that contained real hardship, seasons of drought and seasons of disease in the cattle, and the constant work of managing a complex operation in an unforgiving landscape. It was happiness in the presence of difficulty, the kind that means something because it has been earned and maintained. In the spring of 1887, on a morning in April when the plains were just beginning their annual resurrection, the grass coming back green in the low places along the creek, the cottonwood trees that Vernon had planted putting out their first new leaves, Opal sat on the covered porch of the ranch house with her coffee and watched the land come alive around her. She could hear Thomas somewhere nearby, talking to the sheepdog Miller in the serious, explanatory way he had adopted recently, as though Miller were a student who needed to be brought up to speed on everything. She could hear Clara inside the house making the sounds she made when she was waking from her morning nap, the preliminary vocalizations that presaged a demand for breakfast. She could hear Vernon in the barn, the rhythm of his work audible as a comfortable background presence. She could hear the creek, the water running over the limestone bottom in the patient, continuous way it had been running for thousands of years before she arrived here, and would continue running long after. She sat with her coffee and the morning, and thought about the letter she had carried in her pocket on a Tuesday in October of 1882, the thing she had been dreading for 12 miles, the news she had delivered to a stranger who had not flinched and had asked her not to leave him with it alone. She thought about how the worst news she had ever been asked to deliver had been the beginning of the best thing in her life, and she found this not ironic but simply true. The way many of the most important things turned out to be true, complicated in origin, clear in outcome. Vernon came out of the barn and saw her on the porch and walked toward the house, and she watched him cross the yard in the April morning light, this man who had built this place from next to nothing, and had let her come and be part of it and build alongside him, and she thought, there it is. There is the thing. He came up the porch steps and she handed him the second cup of coffee that she had poured for him, and he took it and sat down beside her, and they looked out at the land together. "Clara's awake," she said. "I know," he said. "I heard. Thomas is educating Miller again." "Miller is getting a thorough education," he agreed. The April wind came off the plains, carrying the smell of new grass and the distant smell of rain that would probably arrive by afternoon, and the cottonwoods along the creek trembled in it, and the cattle in the near pasture moved slowly in the way cattle did in good weather, unhurried and content, and the ranch that had been fought for and saved and built over long years sat solid and real in the light of a morning that showed no signs of being anything other than entirely, completely fine. Thomas came around the corner of the house with Miller at his heels and saw his parents on the porch and broke into the unself-conscious run of a small child approaching something good. And Vernon set his coffee down and caught his son with both arms and swung him up, and the boy's delighted noise rang out over the yard and was absorbed into the wide Kansas air. And inside the house, Clara added her own voice to the morning's conversation. And Opal stood and went inside to bring her daughter out into the spring day. Standing in the main room of the house with Clara on her hip, the natural history book open on the table where she had been reading the previous evening, the bookshelf on the wall with both their volumes mixed together, the piece of cottonwood bark still on the windowsill, she felt the particular fullness of a life that had been arrived at through the precise combination of circumstance and character that produces things you could not have invented if you had tried. She had come west to build something. She had built it. She had built more than she knew how to want, which was, she thought, the best possible outcome of any endeavor. She walked out onto the porch with her daughter, into the spring morning and the wind and the immensity of the Kansas sky, and her husband was there with their son in his arms, and the land was there, and the creek was there, and the cottonwood trees that had been saplings before she was born were fully themselves in the morning light. And she stepped off the last step of the porch and into all of it, and she did not look back because there was no need to, because everything that mattered was right here. In the yard and the warm morning and the face of the man turning toward her, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was home.